They couldn't move the old statue, but when the crane finally lifted it, the entire forest was suddenly sealed off and authorities rushed to the site. What was hidden beneath the stone had been kept secret for decades. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, and write in the comments which city you're watching from. The transfer came without ceremony, as most punishments in the company did. No shouting, no official reprimands, only a short notice pinned to the board in the cramped office trailer, and a curt message from the dispatcher telling him to report to a remote sector by dawn. For years, he had worked the same stretches of forest, moving with the seasons and contracts, knowing the moods of his supervisors and the unwritten rules that governed survival in an industry where accidents were spoken of in whispers and the dead were remembered only in footnotes of safety reports. He had learned early that it was not the chainsaws or the falling trunks that ended careers, but the refusal to look away when something was wrong. The conflict on the previous site had not erupted in anger, but in silence. The slope had been unstable for weeks, a scar in the hillside where spring meltwater had undermined the roots. He had pointed it out more than once, not loudly, not with defiance, only with the stubborn clarity of someone who knew what it meant when a tree began to lean at the wrong angle. The supervisor had nodded, scribbled something meaningless in a notebook, then returned with a stack of forms that needed signatures. They were routine, he was told, confirmation that the corridor had been inspected, that the area was safe for the next stage of felling. He had held the pen in his fingers for a long time, feeling its cheap plastic bite into his skin, and in that pause he had seen the future split into two narrow paths. One led to an easy signature and the quiet continuation of work, the other to trouble that no one would thank him for. He had chosen the second path, leaving the paper blank and sliding it back across the table without a word. From that moment on, the place closed around him. Shifts were changed without warning. His name disappeared from the better rotations, and small mistakes were suddenly magnified into written warnings. No one spoke openly about it, but the message was unmistakable. He was a problem, and problems were moved. So the transfer arrived, to a sector so remote that few in the company had ever worked there, a place that existed more in spreadsheets than in memory. The journey to the new site took almost a full day. The company truck rattled along old logging roads that twisted like scars through the wilderness, crossing makeshift bridges of rotting planks and steel beams bolted together by men who had not been paid to think about the future. Beyond the last cell tower, the signal bars faded into nothing, and even the radio began to hiss with static that drowned out voices. He watched the landscape change through the dusty windshield, the familiar mix of managed forest giving way to darker, denser growth that had not been cut in decades. There were signs of old activity everywhere if you knew how to look for them. A rusted length of cable half buried in moss, a line of stunted trees that marked the edge of a forgotten road, a rectangle of earth where nothing grew, as if the soil itself remembered a structure that had once stood there. When they finally reached the temporary base, it was little more than a clearing hacked from the forest. A row of aging trailers squatted on blocks, their windows clouded with grime, while a generator thumped in a corrugated shed, the sound echoing through the trees like a mechanical heartbeat. The men were unloading fuel drums and crates of spare parts, their movements efficient but weary, and the air carried the familiar mixture of diesel, resin, and damp wood that he had long ago come to associate with both livelihood and danger. The supervisor on site, a narrow-faced man with a permanently furrowed brow, barely looked up from his clipboard when he introduced himself. There was no handshake, only a nod and a brief outline of expectations. Deadlines were tight. The corridor for the new power line had to be cleared before the rains returned, and the company did not intend to miss another contract window. The others eyed him with mild curiosity, a newcomer with no story yet attached to his name, though he could sense the quick calculations behind their glances. Everyone in a crew like this tried to guess what kind of man had just arrived, whether he was a talker, a fighter, or one more body who would keep his head down and take whatever was handed to him. That first evening, he took a slow walk along the edge of the camp, letting the quiet settle around him. Without the constant background hum of civilization, the forest seemed to breathe, a low, collective sound of wind and branches and unseen water moving somewhere in the dark. He had known places like this before, sights that were officially ordinary but carried an unspoken weight, the sense that something had been erased too thoroughly. It was not mysticism that made him uneasy, only experience. The places people forgot were often the places they wanted to forget. The task itself was straightforward on paper. A new line of pylons would cut across the region, bringing electricity to a growing industrial complex miles away. His crew's job was to clear a corridor wide enough for construction and future maintenance, a linear wound through the forest that would be measured, mapped, and then quickly abandoned by those who had ordered it. According to the documents he was shown, the land had been unused for decades. No protected zones, no heritage sites, no reason for delay. Yet, even in those first hours, he noticed the little inconsistencies that did not make it into any report. The ground was too compacted in places, the vegetation too uniform in patterns that suggested old foundations. Here and there, he saw marks on tree trunks that were not the usual blaze of modern surveyors, but something older, a different system of angles and cuts that spoke of people who had worked here long before. The first days were filled with the rhythm of labor. Chainsaws roared from dawn until the light began to fade. Trunks were dragged aside by winches, and the corridor slowly emerged as a scar through the undergrowth. The supervisor pushed them hard, insisting on speed over caution, and the men complied because the alternative was always worse. He worked without complaint, letting his hands remember their tasks even as his eyes catalogued the terrain. The more he looked, the more certain he became that the maps were lying. Not deliberately, perhaps, but through omission. Someone had cleaned this place of its history, leaving only traces that only those who spent their lives in forests would recognize. There was a moment late on the third day when the corridor began to narrow unexpectedly. The trees were standing in an oddly regular formation, their spacing too even, the ground between them strangely clear of the usual debris. He slowed his pace, letting the others surge ahead, and knelt to brush aside a layer of leaves. Beneath was a patch of concrete, cracked and overgrown, but unmistakable. He straightened, his heart beating a little faster, and looked around. If there had been a structure here once, it had been removed with care, its remnants buried and disguised by time. This was not an accident of nature, but the residue of intent. He considered saying something, but the lesson of his transfer was still fresh in his mind. Instead, he noted the location and kept moving, a quiet observer in a crew that valued silence as a form of survival. By the end of the week, the corridor led them into a denser stand of trees, and it was there that the obstacle revealed itself. At first, it seemed no different from the boulders they had encountered before, a dark mass tangled in vines and roots. Only when the saw blades met stone instead of wood did the truth emerge. The men cleared the surrounding growth with growing irritation, and gradually the shape became visible. a towering stone figure rising from the forest floor, its surface streaked with age and lichen. No one could recall seeing anything like it marked on their maps, and yet here it was, planted directly in the path of their work. The supervisor cursed under his breath, already calculating the delays this would bring, while the others circled the structure with a mixture of curiosity and dread. It was not its appearance that unsettled them, but its placement. This was not something a hiker had dragged into the woods, nor a random relic abandoned by chance. It stood where it stood because someone had wanted it to block the way, to force attention on a place that the company's documents insisted was empty. He approached the base of the statue and knelt again, brushing away dirt with careful fingers. The surface beneath was not soil, but a smooth slab of concrete, its edges hidden by decades of leaf fall and creeping roots. He said nothing, but in his mind the pieces were already arranging themselves into an uneasy pattern. Whatever had once existed here had not been erased completely. It had only been buried, waiting for a moment when the forest would be cut back far enough to reveal it again. As the others began arguing about how to remove the obstruction, he remained crouched at the base, feeling the cold certainty settle in his chest that this transfer had not been an escape from trouble, but its beginning. A passage into a story that the forest itself had been holding in silence for far too long. The men gathered around the newly exposed structure in a loose semicircle, their voices subdued in a way that had nothing to do with respect and everything to do with unease. The forest had been loud all morning, with the shriek of saws and the crack of splitting trunks, yet now there was a pause in the labor, a hollow silence that pressed in from the trees, as if the clearing itself were listening. Vines hung from the stone like long dead veins, their roots sunk so deeply into crevices that it was impossible to tell where the statue ended and the forest began. It was massive. Taller than any of them, its form eroded into something that hinted at human features without declaring them clearly. Moss coated the hollows where eyes might once have been carved, and soot-dark streaks marked its surface in places where rainwater had traced paths through old ash. The supervisor broke the quiet first, not with curiosity, but irritation. "This was not on any plan," he said, thumbing through the laminated pages he carried everywhere as if the answer might suddenly appear in a margin. He muttered about lost time and penalties, about the absurdity of finding a monument in the middle of nowhere. To him, it was an obstacle, nothing more. But the others were slower to dismiss it. They walked the circumference of the base, tapping it with boot tips, tugging at the vines, each movement betraying the same question they did not want to voice. Why was it here? He knelt again, closer now, tracing the line of concrete he had glimpsed earlier. It was not the rough, careless pour of a temporary foundation, but something deliberate, smoothed by hands that had taken time to make it fit the stone above. He brushed aside another clump of leaves and uncovered a fragment of brick, blackened as if by fire. The image of his old supervisor sliding that unsigned form back across the table came to him unbidden, and with it the realization that this place was already testing the same boundary between obedience and conscience. When he stood, one of the younger workers was peering at a tablet, scrolling through satellite images that lagged and blurred as the signal fought its way through the canopy. There was nothing there, not on any layer they could access. The forest appeared unbroken, as if the statue were invisible even from the sky. Someone joked that it must have grown here, that maybe they were the first to see it, but the laugh that followed was forced and brief. Everyone in that circle understood the implication. If something this large had stood here for decades, then someone had ensured it was forgotten. The supervisor finally issued orders, impatience hardening his voice. They would try to move it. The power line corridor could not bend around every curiosity, and the company had no budget for archaeological surprises. A few men began uncoiling cables, while others fetched the portable winch from the truck, all the while casting glances back at the statue as though it might respond to their preparations. As they worked, he moved around the base with deliberate slowness, cataloging what the others were too hurried to notice. The soot stains on the stone were not random but clustered on one side, suggesting a source of heat nearby at some point in the past. The concrete platform beneath the statue had edges that disappeared under the soil in straight lines, forming a shape too geometric to be natural. At one corner, he uncovered a sliver of metal, thin and corroded, that might once have been a part of a fitting or a hinge. He said nothing yet, but each detail tightened the sense of wrongness that had settled in his gut. The crew wrapped the first cable around the statue and anchored the other end to a tree that had survived a century of storms. The winch groaned as they applied tension, its motor whining like an animal in pain. Dirt shifted, leaves rustled, but the statue remained unmoved, an island of stubborn mass in a sea of effort. They tried again from a different angle, then another, only succeeding in gouging the stone and snapping a cable that recoiled with a sound like a gunshot. The supervisor swore, his patience thinning with every failure, and demanded that the excavator be brought closer. The excavator's steel arm scraped against the concrete base, showering sparks that flashed briefly before dying in the moss. The bucket dug into the soil around the foundation, revealing more of the slab, its surface curving inward in a way that suggested not a pedestal but a cover. This was no monument set on a simple block. It was something heavier, something designed to stay in place. The men exchanged uneasy looks. Someone muttered that they should at least report this, that there might be regulations about moving old structures, but the supervisor cut him off with a gesture that brooked no argument. They were not historians, he said, and this was not a museum. Their job was to clear the corridor, and every hour spent staring at stone was an hour they would have to make up later. He felt the familiar tension coil in his chest. The words he had held back before now pressed against his teeth, but he swallowed them, aware that he was still new here, still marked by the unspoken reputation of a troublemaker. Instead, he stepped closer to the excavator operator and quietly suggested easing off, pointing to the way the concrete formed a rim rather than a base. The operator hesitated, nodding almost imperceptibly, but the supervisor's barked command overrode any caution. The machine lurched forward, its bucket wedging under the edge of the slab. There was a sound then that was not quite a crack and not quite a groan, a deep, dull resonance that traveled through the ground and into their bones. The slab shifted by a fraction, enough to send a ripple of soil cascading into a narrow gap that had opened along one side. The statue above did not budge, but its immobility now felt different, less like the stubbornness of stone and more like the resistance of something that had been sealed. The forest seemed to close in around them as the light shifted, clouds drifting over the sun to dim the clearing. The men paused, unsure whether to continue, but the supervisor saw only progress in that slight movement. He ordered the winch tightened again, and the cables sang under the strain. Once more, nothing happened, and frustration flared into open anger. He paced around the statue, kicking at clods of earth, railing against delays and hidden obstacles, his words spilling out in a stream of blame that sought a target. It was in the midst of this that he noticed the concrete fragments scattered in a rough semicircle around the base. They were too uniform to be rubble, too carefully shaped. He picked one up, feeling its weight, and for a moment he imagined hands, long gone, fitting these pieces together with the same mixture of haste and secrecy that now defined their attempt to tear it apart. He set the fragment back down and caught the eye of one of the older workers, a man who had been in the forest since before he could remember. The man shook his head almost imperceptibly, a warning that needed no words. By late afternoon, it was clear that brute force alone would not solve the problem. The cables lay in snarled heaps, the excavator idled uselessly, and the statue remained where it had always been, a mute challenge. The supervisor made a call on his phone, walking away from the group until he was little more than a shape among the trees, gesturing wildly as he spoke. When he returned, his face was set in lines that suggested both defeat and resolve. A crane would be brought in, he announced, a heavy one, capable of lifting the entire structure clear if necessary. There was a collective exhale at the prospect of such a machine, as if the mere idea of overwhelming force promised to restore order to the situation. Yet he felt no such relief. A crane meant exposure, not just of the statue, but of whatever lay beneath it, and something in him knew that the company would not welcome what might be found. As the crew dispersed to finish the day's remaining tasks, he lingered by the base, running his fingers along the edge of the concrete until the cold seeped into his skin. The light was fading fast when he finally turned back toward camp, the silhouette of the statue receding into shadow behind him. He could not shake the image of the hidden lines beneath the soil, the straight edges and buried corners that mark the place as something built, not grown. Whatever story the forest had been telling him since his arrival was converging here, at this immovable point in the corridor, and he understood that the transfer that had brought him to this forgotten place was no accident of bureaucracy. It was a collision of paths, his own stubborn refusal to look away meeting a secret that had waited patiently for someone like him to arrive. The promise of the crane hovered over the camp like a distant thunderhead, a solution postponed just long enough to allow impatience to fester. The supervisor did not wait for morning to renew the assault on the statue. He ordered the men back at first light, determined to make one more round of attempts with the tools they already had, as though persistence alone could rewrite the laws of physics. The forest woke reluctantly around them, mist clinging to the undergrowth, the smell of damp earth heavy in the air, and by the time the engines of the winches were running again, the birds had retreated deeper into the canopy. They wrapped fresh cables around the statue, threading them through the few exposed grooves in the stone, anchoring the other ends to trees that groaned under the sudden strain. The sound of metal under tension cut through the quiet, a thin, screaming note that made several of the men wince. He watched the lines, noting the way they angled downward, the way the concrete rim beneath the statue did not shift even when the cables were taut enough to vibrate. The first pull ended in the same anticlimax as the day before. The ground trembled, leaves shook loose from branches, but the statue did not yield. The supervisor called for a second attempt, this time with a different orientation, convinced that they had simply chosen the wrong vector. The men complied, though the earlier bravado had faded into something closer to resignation. The winch strained again, its motor climbing into a shrill pitch that made his teeth ache. And then there was a sharp crack as one of the cables snapped. It recoiled with terrifying speed, slicing through the air and burying itself in a tree trunk with a thud that echoed through the clearing. For a moment, no one moved. The danger had been real, and they all knew it. A step to the left or right, and the cable would have found flesh instead of wood. He felt anger stir beneath his composure, not at the machine or the stubbornness of the stone, but at the refusal to acknowledge what was unfolding before them. The concrete base was not an obstacle to be bullied into submission. It was a boundary, a lid, something that had been placed there to remain. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again as the supervisor barked orders to reset the equipment, his voice louder now, tinged with the edge of fear that often masqueraded as authority. The excavator was brought closer, its treads chewing into the soil, the operator maneuvering with the care of someone who understood the limits of his machine, even as he was being pushed to exceed them. The bucket scraped against the concrete, dislodging chunks that fell into the growing trench around the base. Dust rose in a fine cloud that caught in his throat, and he tasted old cement, dry and bitter, as if the air itself were protesting the intrusion. As more of the slab was exposed, its shape became clearer. This was not a simple platform poured to support a decorative object. It curved inward at the edges, forming a shallow basin whose perimeter was reinforced with lengths of rebar bent and tied by hand. He crouched to examine it, while the others argued about leverage points, running his fingers along the rough seam where concrete met soil. It was colder here, the ground holding a chill that did not match the mild air above. He imagined an empty space beneath, sealed and forgotten, and a sense of unease settled in his chest. The supervisor, growing increasingly frustrated, ordered the excavator to try prying from below. The bucket slipped under the lip of the slab and levered upward, and for a moment the machine seemed to succeed. The slab lifted a fraction, enough for him to see darkness beyond the gap, but then the weight of the statue above forced it back into place with a dull thump that reverberated through the ground. A shudder ran through the crew, a shared recognition that they were not merely fighting stone, but something more substantial. The mood in the clearing soured. Men snapped at each other over small mistakes, the strain of repeated failure eroding the thin layer of camaraderie that usually held them together. Someone suggested skirting the statue, rerouting the corridor around it, but the supervisor dismissed the idea with a wave of his hand. Altering the line would require new surveys, new approvals, delays that would ripple through the project like a disease. It was easier, he insisted, to remove one stubborn object than to rewrite a plan approved by people who would never set foot in this forest. He noticed the way the men avoided his eyes as he moved among them, the quiet resentment that clung to him as if he were the embodiment of the problem itself. They knew he had seen something, that he was withholding a judgment that might force them all into a conflict with management. He could almost hear the thought passing between them, a shared plea for silence. They had families to support, debts to pay, lives that depended on keeping their heads down. Who was he to threaten that with his misgivings? During a brief lull, he took a solitary walk around the perimeter of the site, letting the noise of the machines fade behind him. The forest here bore the marks of human presence in ways that the official maps had ignored. He found a line of earthworks that traced a faint rectangle, the remains of a foundation long collapsed, and a scatter of broken glass half buried in leaf litter that glittered faintly in the filtered light. Further on, he came across a stretch of ground where the vegetation grew in a different pattern. The soil compacted in a way that suggested heavy foot traffic decades before. Each discovery deepened his conviction that the statue was not an anomaly, but a marker, a way of sealing off a chapter that someone had gone to great lengths to erase. When he returned to the clearing, the excavator was idling, its operator arguing with the supervisor about the safety of continuing. The man was right to hesitate. The risk of destabilizing the statue was real, and with it, the risk of injury or worse. The supervisor dismissed these concerns with a clipped assurance that they would be careful, though his eyes flicked nervously towards the slab even as he spoke. As the afternoon wore on, the repeated failures wore down what remained of the crew's resolve. The cables lay twisted and frayed. The excavator bore fresh scratches along its arm, and the statue stood as implacable as ever. The supervisor paced like a caged animal, muttering into his phone as he tried to reach someone higher up the chain of command. When he finally hung up, he announced with forced confidence that the crane would arrive the following morning, its operator already en route from the nearest town that could support such equipment. Relief rippled through the men at the prospect of a definitive solution, but it did not touch him. He was standing near the base of the slab when he noticed a small glint in the soil, something metallic catching the last rays of sun. He knelt and dug gently with his fingers, extracting a tiny object caked in rust and dirt. It was a child's clothing tag, the kind sewn into jackets to mark ownership in institutional settings, its stamped number barely legible beneath the corrosion. He closed his hand around it, feeling the weight of the discovery settle in his palm like a verdict. That night, he could not sleep. The trailers were quiet, the generator's steady rumble the only sound that cut through the dark, but his mind refused to follow his body into rest. He kept seeing the slab lifting for that brief instant, the darkness beneath it, the child's tag in his hand. He slipped out of bed and pulled on his boots, moving as silently as he could through the narrow aisle, past men who snored or stared blankly at the ceiling. Outside, the forest was a cathedral of shadow, the moonlight filtering through branches to paint the ground in silver. He made his way back to the statue, guided more by instinct than sight, and crouched beside the base. In the stillness of night, the place felt different, stripped of the noise and aggression of the day. He brushed aside loose soil and leaves, exposing more of the concrete rim, and traced the edge with his fingers until he found a seam, a place where the slab had been joined to something below. There was a hollow sound when he tapped it, faint but unmistakable, and it sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the night air. He replaced the dirt carefully, erasing his presence as best he could, and returned to the trailer with the child's tag hidden in his pocket. By the time dawn crept through the small window, he had made a decision he could no longer avoid. The crane would lift the statue, that was now inevitable, and when it did, whatever lay beneath would be revealed. The question was not whether the secret would surface, but who would control the story when it did. He lay there, listening to the forest wake, aware that the transfer that had brought him here had not only altered his path, but placed him on the edge of something vast, something that would not be undone by broken cables or stubborn supervisors. The crane arrived just after sunrise, its long boom rising above the treetops like the neck of some prehistoric creature that had wandered into the clearing by mistake. The driver eased it into position with a precision born of years spent coaxing impossible machines through impossible places, while the supervisor hovered nearby, his agitation barely contained. The night's dew still clung to the ground, turning the soil into a treacherous paste, and the men hurried to lay down timber mats and scatter gravel so the massive vehicle would not sink under its own weight. He stood apart from the others, the child's rusted tag warm in his pocket despite the morning chill. The decision he had made in the dark had hardened into resolve, though he did not yet know what form it would take. All he knew was that the moment the statue left the earth, the story would belong to whoever had the courage to tell it first, The preparations took longer than the supervisor liked. The crane operator insisted on checking every chain and shackle twice, explaining in patient tones that lifting a structure of unknown weight without proper balance was an invitation to disaster. The statue was more than a simple block of stone. Its mass was uneven, eroded in places, overgrown in others, and it sat on a base whose true dimensions no one could yet see. The men circled it like surgeons preparing for a risky operation, clearing away vines, brushing off decades of grime to find solid points where the lifting slings could be anchored. As the chains were threaded beneath the stone, he felt the air change, a subtle tightening that passed through the crew. The forest had never seemed so quiet, the birds holding back their morning chorus as if in anticipation. The supervisor barked instructions that grew sharper with every minute, his need to regain control of the schedule overwhelming any lingering caution. When the crane operator finally gave a nod, the men stepped back, forming a wide ring around the statue. The winch on the crane engaged with a deep mechanical hum, the chains drawing taut until they sang. For a heartbeat, nothing happened, and then, slowly, with a reluctance that seemed almost human, the statue lifted. There was no dramatic lurch, no cascade of debris, only a steady rise that peeled it away from the concrete rim it had hidden for so long. Soil crumbled from its underside, falling in soft patters that sounded too loud in the stillness. He leaned forward despite himself, eyes fixed on the gap widening between stone and ground. Beneath the statue lay a shape that was not random, not the irregular depression of natural settling, but the clean outline of a rectangular cavity. The concrete slab that had once sealed it was fractured and incomplete, as though someone had hurried to cover something and time had finished the job of undoing their haste. As the statue climbed higher, the cavity was revealed in full. It was shallow but deliberate, its walls smoothed by hand, its floor littered with objects that seemed at first like nothing more than debris. Then his mind caught up to what his eyes were seeing, and the world narrowed to a single, unbearable clarity. There were shoes there, small ones, dozens of them, arranged not in any pattern but clustered together as if they had been tossed in haste. Some were little more than scraps of leather and cloth, but others were intact enough to show their bright colors beneath the dirt, a mute testament to the children who had worn them. The murmur that rose from the crew was not a word but a collective intake of breath, a sound born of shock rather than speech. One man swore softly, another turned away, and someone near the back laughed once, sharply, as if his body did not yet know how to process what it had seen. The crane operator froze, holding the statue suspended in midair, his eyes wide as he stared down at the pit. The supervisor was the first to find his voice, though it was not the voice of a man confronting a tragedy, but of one facing an inconvenience. He stepped closer to the edge of the cavity, peering down as if trying to determine whether the mess could be categorized and dismissed. He said something about old belongings, about the possibility of this being a forgotten dumping spot, but his words were swallowed by the reality unfolding before them. He moved closer as well, careful not to jostle the men who had drifted forward in a daze. The shoes were not the only items. He saw scraps of clothing with numbers sewn into the fabric, the remnants of uniforms perhaps, and among them thin plastic tags bearing names and dates. Papers lay curled and yellowed in the damp, some stamped with seals so faded they were barely visible, others scrawled with lists that seemed endless when he began to read them. The supervisor's composure cracked then, though not in the way he had hoped. He snapped orders with a desperation that bordered on panic, telling the crane operator to set the statue down, to cover the hole, to get the men back to work. He spoke of delays, of paperwork, of the company's liability, as if these were shields strong enough to deflect the weight of what lay at their feet. It was in that moment that he pulled out his phone, the movement instinctive, his hands acting before his mind could catch up. He took photographs of the cavity, of the shoes, of the tags, of the list that fluttered in the slight breeze stirred by the crane's boom. He knew he should be careful, that there were eyes on him now, but the urgency of the act drowned out all caution. This was the proof that would prevent the story from being buried again. A hand closed around his arm, rough and insistent, and he turned to find the supervisor's face inches from his own, flushed with anger. He was told to put the phone away, to remember where he was and who paid his wages, but the words slid past him, their meaning dulled by the roar in his ears. Around them the men were arguing, voices overlapping in a jumble of fear and disbelief. One of them bent down to pick up a small jacket, only to recoil as if burned, dropping it back into the pit. The supervisor made a show of regaining control, calling for shovels, insisting that the cavity be filled and the statue replaced as quickly as possible. He spoke of safety, of the risk of leaving such a hole exposed, and though the justification rang hollow, it carried the weight of authority that had kept the crew in line for years. A few men hesitated, torn between obedience and revulsion, but habit is a powerful force, and they began to move as instructed. He slipped away from the center of the chaos, retreating to the edge of the clearing where the trees closed in once more. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline of the moment coursing through him, but he forced himself to keep moving, to find a place where he could think. The images on his phone were a fragile lifeline, a way of holding the truth in a world that seemed determined to smother it. When he returned, the pit was already half filled, dirt and gravel cascading down to cover the shoes and papers, turning horror back into an abstraction. The statue lay on its side nearby, an ungainly shape robbed of its authority waiting to be hoisted back into place. The men avoided his gaze, their faces set in lines of shame and relief, the latter born of the knowledge that the unbearable sight was being erased. He stood there until the last shovel of earth fell into the cavity, until the crane lifted the statue once more and lowered it over the makeshift grave, sealing it with the same brutal efficiency that had hidden it for decades. The forest seemed to exhale as the stone settled into place, its presence once again a mute barrier in the corridor. The supervisor clapped his hands together and announced a break, his voice overly bright, his eyes darting as if expecting the trees themselves to accuse him. As the men drifted away to eat and smoke and avoid thinking, he remained by the base of the statue, staring at the place where the truth had vanished beneath layers of soil and authority. The child's tag burned against his thigh, a reminder that the pit was not empty, that what had been uncovered could not be undone simply by covering it again. He knew then that the story had not ended with the lift. It had only begun, and the weight of it would follow him long after the crane's engine fell silent and the forest reclaimed its uneasy calm. The forest returned to its routines with unsettling speed. By the time the men had finished their break, the pit beneath the statue had been smothered beneath fresh earth, tamped down and leveled until it blended with the surrounding soil. The statue itself stood upright once more, its chains removed, its stone skin streaked with new scratches where the slings had bitten into it. Anyone arriving later would see nothing out of the ordinary, just another forgotten monument in a forgotten place. That was, after all, the intention. He did not join the others when they resumed work along the corridor. Instead, he lingered near the base of the statue under the pretense of checking equipment, his mind too loud to allow him to pretend that what he had seen was merely an inconvenience. The phone in his pocket felt heavier than it had that morning, the photographs within it not simply images, but a responsibility he could no longer set down. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the small shoes clustered together like abandoned birds' nests, the numbers stitched into clothing that had been worn by bodies now erased from any ledger that mattered. The supervisor watched him from a distance, suspicion written into every line of his posture. Orders were relayed through intermediaries rather than directly, as though even proximity were now a liability. By late afternoon, the message was unmistakable. He was to be kept busy, away from the statue, away from any chance to revisit the cavity that no longer existed. The corridor pushed forward, chainsaws carving a path that ignored the stone sentinel entirely, as if by refusing to acknowledge it they could make it irrelevant. That night, when the generators hummed low and the trailers settled into a chorus of muffled sleep, he lay awake with his phone balanced on his chest, the screen dark but expectant. The child's rusted tag lay on the narrow shelf above his bunk, the stamped number barely legible under the dim light. He took it down and turned it over in his fingers, feeling the rough edges where corrosion had eaten into the metal. Someone had once sewn that tag into a jacket, believing perhaps that it would keep a child from being lost. The bitter irony of that faith made his throat tighten. He unlocked the phone and scrolled through the images he had captured in the chaos of the morning. The first few were blurred, his hands unsteady, but soon the details sharpened. Rows of shoes, some with laces still tied, others collapsed in on themselves. The edges of paper lists, names marching down the page in neat columns interrupted by red marks that crossed some of them out. He zoomed in, reading slowly, letting each letter form in his mind. There were patterns here, he realized, the same surnames appearing again and again across different pages, dates clustered within a narrow span of years. Some entries bore notes in the margins, words like transferred, unfit, no data, their bureaucratic coldness made obscene by the context. He copied the names into a notebook he kept for measurements and site notes, careful to disguise the nature of the entries among figures and sketches of terrain. If the phone were taken from him, he wanted the information to survive somewhere else. The act of writing steadied him, turning shock into a kind of grim focus. He had spent his childhood in places where children were counted and recounted like inventory, where identity was reduced to a line on a form that could be altered or erased with the stroke of a pen. Seeing those same marks here, on lists buried beneath a statue, felt like the closing of a terrible circle. In the days that followed, pressure from above intensified. The supervisor began to refer to the discovery only as a distraction, a misunderstanding that had been resolved. He made a show of efficiency, ensuring that progress along the corridor was documented in photographs and daily reports that left no room for anomalies. The men complied with varying degrees of enthusiasm, some grateful for the return to routine, others quieter than before, their eyes haunted by what they had glimpsed. He tried to raise the subject in small ways, asking if anyone else had noticed the numbers on the clothing, the stamps on the papers, but his questions met with evasion. A few of the older workers shrugged, muttering that it was none of their business, that whatever had happened was long past. One man snapped that he had 3 kids to feed and could not afford to be dragged into trouble over something that could not be undone. Their fear was understandable, but it did not lessen the weight pressing on his chest. Late one afternoon, he slipped away from the crew under the guise of surveying the next section of forest. He followed a barely visible depression in the ground that ran parallel to the corridor, its edges softened by decades of leaf fall. The further he went, the clearer the signs became. This had once been a road, narrow but deliberate, leading toward the statue from deeper in the woods. He found fragments of brick scattered along its length, their surfaces blackened, and a length of rusted pipe jutting from the soil like a broken bone. Kneeling, he brushed away the dirt around it and uncovered the flange of what might once have been a boiler vent. He took photographs, careful to include wide shots that showed the relationship between these remnants and the statue's location. If anyone ever questioned his interpretation, he wanted the context preserved. The company's maps might show nothing here, but the land itself told a different story, one of structures raised and then erased, of activity compressed into silence. The supervisor's reaction when he noticed his absence was swift and cold. He was reprimanded for wandering off task, reminded that his role was to cut and clear, not to play detective. The rebuke carried a threat he had heard too many times before, the promise that further deviations would be reflected in his evaluation. He accepted the lecture with downcast eyes, but inside he was already compiling a list of contacts, people outside the company who might listen where his colleagues would not. His search for information expanded beyond the forest. In the brief windows of connectivity he found by climbing ridges or standing at the edge of the camp where the signal was strongest, he began to trawl through online archives. He searched for mentions of fires, closures, relocations of institutions in the region during the years that matched the dates on the lists. At first, there was nothing. Then, a single scanned article from a defunct local newspaper, its headline so bland it almost escaped notice. A minor blaze at a children's facility, it read, quickly contained, no casualties reported, operations to be transferred elsewhere. The date matched perfectly. His hands shook as he read the rest. The article was brief, lacking names or specifics, its language vague to the point of uselessness. There was no mention of where the children had been sent, only an assurance that they were safe. He cross-referenced the facility's name with the numbers on the tags and found nothing official, no listing in any current registry. It was as though the institution had existed in a parallel world, one whose records had been quietly excised. He turned next to social media, joining obscure regional groups where older residents reminisced about the past. At first, his inquiries were general, careful not to raise alarm, but gradually he narrowed his focus, asking about old children's homes, about fires, about places that no longer appeared on maps. Most replies were dismissive, but a few carried a different tone. Someone mentioned a closed boarding school in the woods that no one had been allowed to visit. Another recalled trucks moving at night after a blaze, escorted by police, the road closed for hours without explanation. These fragments were not proof, but they were echoes, and together they formed a pattern that aligned too neatly with the evidence beneath the statue to ignore. He saved the messages, taking screenshots in case they were deleted, his digital archive growing alongside the handwritten names in his notebook. The supervisor's attempts to contain the situation grew more overt. One morning, he found his assignment changed, sent to a distant edge of the corridor where the work was monotonous and isolated. It was a thinly veiled attempt to keep him away from the statue, to make his curiosity inconvenient. He complied outwardly, felling trees with mechanical efficiency, but his mind remained anchored to the lists and the shoes, to the children who had once been numbers on a tag and were now nothing at all. The memory of his own childhood intruded more often than he liked. He recalled the echoing hallways of the institution where he had grown up, the way children disappeared between semesters with no explanation beyond a whispered transfer. He had learned not to ask questions, not to look too closely at empty beds, because curiosity had never been rewarded. Standing in the forest, knowing what he now knew, he understood that those disappearances were not isolated accidents, but part of a system that thrived on silence. By the end of the week, the corridor had advanced far enough that the statue lay behind a wall of felled trunks and churned earth, hidden from casual view. The supervisor seemed satisfied, his reports glowing with progress, but the tension around him had not eased. He avoided eye contact with the crew, his conversations brief and guarded, as though he feared any exchange might expose more than he could control. He did not share that fear. Each night he added to his notebook, copying names until his hand cramped, comparing dates, building a ledger of absence. He knew he could not confront the company alone, not when they were already maneuvering to isolate him. What he needed was daylight, the kind that came not from a clearing in the forest but from public attention. And for that, he would need to carry the list beyond the reach of the statue's shadow. The corridor pushed deeper into the forest each day, the sound of saws echoing farther from the place where the statue now stood once more, sealed into its false stillness. Yet for him, distance did nothing to dull the presence of what had been uncovered. The lists were no longer simply names on paper. They had begun to form a constellation of lives, each entry a point of light in a map that only he seemed willing to read. Whenever the work took him to higher ground, where the trees thinned and the air carried a hint of signal, he pulled out his phone and searched. His queries were cautious at first, phrased broadly, but soon sharpened by the dates he had copied so meticulously into his notebook. The articles that emerged were few and fragmentary, scattered across forgotten corners of the internet like debris from a shipwreck. Most were nothing more than dry notices of administrative changes, the closure of facilities, the relocation of services, the sort of bureaucratic reshuffling that rarely merited more than a paragraph in the local paper. But woven through them was a recurring phrase, always vague, always reassuring. After the fire, the children were transferred. After the restructuring, the pupils were reassigned. After the emergency, no casualties were reported. He read those words over and over, the hollowness of them growing more obscene with every repetition. The dates aligned with the red marks he had seen on the lists, the same years that clustered around the small shoes and numbered jackets. It was not one event. Not a single accident that had led to the burial beneath the statue. It was a pattern, a series of administrative gestures that had allowed an entire institution to vanish from the public record without anyone asking where its inhabitants had gone. Late one evening, he found a scanned copy of an article so faded it was barely legible, preserved on the personal website of a man who had once collected local history as a hobby. The headline spoke of a minor blaze at a rural boarding facility, the language carefully chosen to avoid alarm. It described smoke damage, a swift response by emergency services, the temporary relocation of staff. There was no mention of the children themselves, only the assurance that they were being cared for elsewhere. He stared at the screen, imagining the author typing those words with the same distance that the supervisor had shown when ordering the pit filled, reducing a human calamity to a paragraph that could be filed and forgotten. He turned to social networks next, joining obscure regional groups where the past was not yet entirely buried beneath algorithms and advertising. He posted questions under a pseudonym, careful to avoid specifics that might attract unwanted attention, asking about old schools in the forest, about places that had closed suddenly in the late 80s and early 90s. The responses trickled in slowly, but when they came, they carried the weight of memory. One woman recalled a cousin who had worked at a children's home in the woods, a place surrounded by fences and patrolled by guards, where visitors were discouraged and cameras forbidden. Another spoke of a night when the road had been blocked by police vehicles, lights flashing silently in the dark as trucks rumbled past toward the highway. Each fragment added to the shape taking form in his mind. He began to sketch it out in his notebook, not as a map, but as a narrative, linking the remnants he had found in the forest with the accounts of those who had lived nearby. There was a logic to it, grim and methodical. Children without documentation were gathered into a facility that existed in a gray zone of oversight, its purpose obscured even to those who worked there. When something went wrong, whether through neglect, malice, or sheer indifference, the institution was erased rather than reformed. The fire was not the beginning, but the excuse, the moment that allowed everything that followed to be framed as necessity rather than crime. His own memories sharpened the edges of this reconstruction. He could still smell the disinfectant of the dormitories where he had slept as a boy, the way it mixed with sweat and cheap detergent to create a scent that never truly left your clothes. He remembered the faces of children who had arrived one day and were gone the next, their bunks stripped of bedding, their names never spoken again. At the time, he had accepted the official explanations because there was no alternative. Now, standing in the forest where shoes lay buried beneath a statue, he understood that those disappearances were not isolated events, but part of a larger, quieter catastrophe. The terrain itself began to reveal more to him as he learned how to read it. He noticed the way the ground sloped gently away from the statue, forming a shallow basin that would have directed water and smoke away from a central structure. There were remnants of foundations scattered in a rough grid, too uniform to be anything but the footprints of buildings. In one place, he found a cluster of charred beams half submerged in the soil, their ends cut cleanly rather than snapped, suggesting deliberate dismantling rather than collapse. He photographed everything, careful to include wide angles that showed how these fragments related to one another, building a visual argument that could not be dismissed as coincidence. The supervisor had begun to avoid him entirely, assigning intermediaries to relay instructions, but the rest of the crew had grown quiet around him as well. They sensed that something was happening beyond the routine of their labor, something that might draw attention they could not afford. Their silence was not hostility so much as self-preservation, but it left him increasingly alone with his findings. One night, after hours of combing through old digital archives, he stumbled upon a thread that had been abandoned years earlier, its participants long since dispersed. It was a discussion about missing children from the region, posted by a man searching for his sister, who had vanished from an orphanage after being transferred to a facility with no listed address. The thread contained little in the way of answers, only shared frustration and grief. But as he scrolled, he saw names that matched those in his notebook, the same surnames repeated with desperate regularity. He felt a surge of cold recognition, the abstract horror of the lists resolving into a human story that could no longer be ignored. He reached out to the man through a private message, hesitant but determined, asking for any information he might be willing to share. The reply came hours later, brief and cautious, but it confirmed what he had begun to suspect. The orphanage had been rumored to operate under a different authority than most, its records sealed, its staff rotated frequently. After the fire, the building had been razed within weeks, the site fenced off, and then quietly absorbed back into the forest. No one had ever been allowed to see what remained. By then, he had also uncovered the name of a former forestry official who had overseen the area during the relevant years, a man who had later been decorated for his service and appointed to a comfortable administrative post in the city. The connection was circumstantial but compelling. Someone with control over the land had facilitated the disappearance of an institution and everything it contained, replacing it with a statue that offered the illusion of commemoration while concealing the truth beneath its base. The weight of this history pressed on him as he returned each day to the physical labor of clearing the corridor. The trees fell as they always had, their rings bearing silent witness to seasons of growth and neglect. But now he saw in them the echoes of another timeline, one in which children had lived and died within earshot of where he stood. The lists in his notebook grew longer as he pieced together more names from online accounts and faded documents, his handwriting tightening as if to resist the erasure that had claimed them once before. He knew he could not carry this alone much longer. The supervisor's attempts to isolate him were becoming more aggressive, and the company's control over the site was absolute. If the story were to emerge, it would have to leave the forest, carried by voices that could not be silenced with a reassignment or a threat. He began to compile his materials into a single package, not yet ready to send it but unwilling to delay indefinitely. The past had waited beneath the statue for decades. It would not wait for him to find his courage. The corridor had begun to resemble a road more than a scar, its edges smoothed by the constant passage of machinery, its center a churned ribbon of mud and splintered roots. To the supervisors in distant offices, this progress would appear as nothing more than a line advancing across a map, but to him it felt like a countdown. With every meter cleared, the place where the statue stood was pushed further into the periphery of daily operations, its secret layered over by routine until it might as well never have existed. The first article appeared online late on a Sunday evening, when the camp was quiet and the forest lay in a kind of suspended breath between dusk and dawn. He had sent his initial package of photographs and notes to a journalist he had identified through months of careful observation, a woman whose previous work suggested a stubborn resistance to pressure and a willingness to pursue stories others had abandoned. Her response had been measured, her questions precise, but when the link finally arrived in his inbox, he felt the ground tilt beneath him. The piece was cautious in its language, framed as an inquiry rather than an accusation, but the images were unmistakable. The small shoes, the numbered clothing, the list blurred just enough to protect names while still conveying the magnitude of the find. It spoke of a statue in a remote forest, of a cavity filled and sealed with suspicious speed, of records that did not align with official accounts. It did not name the company or the individuals involved, but it did what he had hoped. It made silence impossible. The reaction was swift and chaotic. His phone lit up with notifications from strangers, messages that alternated between gratitude and disbelief. The supervisor summoned the entire crew to an impromptu meeting, his face a mask of fury that barely concealed the fear beneath. He railed about leaks and traitors, about reputations ruined by half-truths, but his words rang hollow in a clearing where everyone now knew that what had been uncovered was more than a misunderstanding. He stood at the back of the group, his posture neutral, his eyes fixed on a point beyond the supervisor's shoulder where the forest thickened into shadow. He had expected anger, had even braced himself for physical confrontation, but what unsettled him more was the pleading note that crept into the tirade. The supervisor spoke of families and mortgages, of the fragility of their livelihoods, as if invoking these shared vulnerabilities might compel him to retreat into the collective instinct to protect one's own at any cost. That instinct was powerful, and it did not belong solely to those in authority. One of the men cornered him later, his voice low and urgent, asking whether he understood what he was risking, not just for himself, but for all of them. He did not answer because there was no response that could bridge the gulf between fear and conscience. He had already chosen his side the moment he lifted his phone over the pit beneath the statue. The company moved quickly to contain the damage. An official memo circulated declaring that the find had been misrepresented, that internal reviews had found nothing of concern, that operations would continue without interruption. Trucks arrived under cover of darkness, bearing fresh loads of soil, and work crews were reassigned to the statue's location with orders to restore the site to its previous condition. The message was clear. They intended to bury the story as thoroughly as they had buried the shoes. He knew he had little time left to act. The journalist had asked for more, for corroboration, for names, and he had begun to compile everything he had gathered into a single encrypted archive. The photographs, the copied lists, the screenshots of conversations with local residents, the scans of old articles, the maps he had drawn by hand to show how the remnants in the forest fit together. It was a precarious bundle of truth, easily destroyed if he were careless. The pressure intensified from all sides. He was called into the supervisor's trailer and offered a compromise that was barely disguised as a threat. The company would forget his involvement, he was told, if he agreed to issue a statement recanting the article's claims and return his materials. There would be a bonus, perhaps even a promotion, an acknowledgement that he had been a good employee who had made a mistake under stress. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, and when the offer was complete, he declined with a single sentence that felt both insufficient and irrevocable. After that, the hostility became overt. He was assigned the most grueling tasks, the kind designed to exhaust rather than to produce, and when he asked for clarification, he was met with bureaucratic indifference. His name was removed from rotation list, his access to shared equipment restricted. Small humiliations piled atop one another in a pattern he recognized from his childhood. It was the same method institutions used to discipline the inconvenient, eroding resolve through attrition rather than confrontation. Yet, he was not entirely alone. One of the older workers approached him during a break, his face lined with a weariness that suggested decades of compromise. He spoke haltingly, as if unused to admitting vulnerability, and told him about a niece who had vanished into the foster system years earlier, her trail ending in a facility that no longer existed. He could not prove that the girl was among the names on the lists, but the possibility had haunted him ever since the article appeared. He did not offer his name or any concrete help, only a quiet acknowledgement that the story mattered. The next piece was more direct. The journalist had tracked down former residents of the region, had begun to assemble a picture that mirrored his own findings. This time, the article named the year of the fire, the existence of a closed children's institution, the pattern of administrative transfers that followed. The response was immediate and explosive. Local news outlets picked up the story, then national ones, each adding its own layer of scrutiny and speculation. Comment sections filled with people searching for lost siblings, for answers that had been denied them for decades. The company's attempt to reclaim control over the narrative grew desperate. Lawyers sent cease and desist letters, executives issued statements of concern, and an internal investigation was announced with great fanfare. On the ground, however, the reality was unchanged. The statue still stood, the pit still filled, the list still buried beneath stone and silence. He felt the familiar surge of anger at this disparity, the knowledge that without external pressure the system would absorb the shock and continue as it always had. He made copies of his archive and sent them to multiple contacts, spreading the risk as widely as he could. He slept poorly, expecting each night to be his last in the camp. But when dawn came, it was not to dismissal or arrest, but to the arrival of vehicles bearing official insignia. Men and women in plain jackets stepped out, their expressions professional and unreadable, and the supervisor's bluster evaporated in the face of their authority. The site was cordoned off before anyone could object, and work was halted with a single, unambiguous order. As he watched the officials set up their equipment, he felt the knot in his chest loosen for the first time since the crane had lifted the statue. This was not victory, not yet, but it was a breach in the wall that had held for so long. The choice he had made, costly and isolating though it had been, had carried the truth out of the forest and into the light where it could no longer be ignored. The forest that had absorbed so much silence over the years did not recognize authority, yet it yielded to it all the same. Within hours of the official's arrival, bright tape cut through the greens and browns of the clearing, cordoning off the place where the statue stood as though it were a wound that could be contained by color alone. The generators were shut down, the saws left hanging from shoulders like useless ornaments, and the men who had carved the corridor through the trees found themselves standing idle, uncertain whether to feel relieved or exposed. He watched from the edge of the camp as the investigators unpacked their equipment with a deliberateness that contrasted sharply with the hurried brutality of the company's previous actions. They measured, photographed, and marked, their voices low and professional, as if they were afraid to disturb something that had waited so long to be seen. The supervisor attempted to insert himself into the process, hovering at the boundary of the tape with a forced smile, but he was gently and firmly directed away. For the first time since his arrival, the site no longer belonged to the company. When the statue was lifted again, it was with none of the impatience that had accompanied the crane's earlier work. The machine that raised it now moved at a glacial pace, its operator guided by instructions relayed through headsets, every inch of ascent documented. As the stone cleared the ground, the cavity beneath was revealed once more, the soil that had been hastily poured into it spilling away to expose the outlines of what lay beneath. The shoes appeared first, then the scraps of clothing, and finally the papers that had been crushed and buried with such careless finality. He stood with his hands clenched at his sides, the sensation of witnessing the same horror twice almost unbearable. This time, however, the scene was met not with panic or denial, but with a measured, solemn response. The investigators knelt at the edge of the pit, gloved hands hovering over the objects as if asking permission before touching them. They spoke in technical terms about stratigraphy and preservation, about the need to document every layer before removal. But beneath the jargon, he sensed the same shock that had frozen the crew days earlier. The excavation proceeded in careful stages, each scoop of soil cataloged, each artifact placed in a labeled container. He saw items emerge that had been missed in the first chaotic reveal, small personal effects that made the loss painfully specific. A bent metal spoon engraved with a child's initials, a fabric badge sewn into a sleeve, a broken pencil with teeth marks along its length. These were not remnants of neglect, but of lives interrupted, daily objects caught in the moment when routine had been obliterated by disaster or design. News of the excavation traveled faster than any of the company's memos ever had. By the second day, reporters clustered beyond the tape, their cameras trained on the statue as though it were a suspect being led into custody. The stories they filed were no longer tentative. They spoke of a hidden institution, of children without records, of a fire that had never been fully explained. The names he had copied into his notebook began to surface, blurred at first, Then, with increasing clarity, as officials confirmed matches with old case files, families arrived in ones and twos at the edge of the cordon, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and dread. He watched a woman clutching a faded photograph to her chest, her eyes fixed on the investigator's hands as if willing them to uncover something recognizable. Another man stood with his back to the forest, staring at the sky, his lips moving in a silent prayer that seemed less about answers than endurance. They had waited decades for this moment, for someone to acknowledge that the disappearances were not figments of grief, but the result of a system that had failed them all. The lists that had once been buried beneath the statue were now spread across folding tables in a temporary tent, their fragile pages protected by plastic sleeves. He was allowed inside only briefly, escorted by an official who treated him with a cautious respect. But the sight of those names laid out in the open nearly broke him. Each line was being entered into a database, cross-referenced with missing persons reports, death certificates, any scrap of information that might restore a fragment of identity to the children who had been reduced to numbers. In the days that followed, the investigation widened to encompass the broader network that had enabled the concealment. Former administrators were summoned for questioning, their public reputations dissolving under the weight of evidence. Financial records were examined, revealing payments for construction and maintenance that corresponded suspiciously with the erection of the statue and the reclamation of the land. The narrative that emerged was not of a single villain, but of a chain of complicity, each link justified by the one before it until the truth was buried beneath layers of convenience. He found himself called upon more often than he had expected, asked to clarify details of the discovery, to point out features of the terrain that supported the reconstruction of events. Each interview took a toll, reopening wounds he had only just begun to acknowledge, but he answered with the same stubborn clarity that had defined his refusal to sign that first false report. He had not sought this role, yet he accepted it because the alternative was to retreat into the anonymity that had allowed the crime to persist. As the story spread, more relatives came forward, their accounts forming a chorus of loss that no amount of official reassurance could quiet. Some were angry, others numb, but all shared the same need to attach a face to a name, to anchor decades of uncertainty in something solid. The investigators worked methodically, matching genetic samples where possible, piecing together timelines that stretched back to the years when the forest had still echoed with children's voices. The statue itself was removed from the site and transported to a storage facility pending further examination. Stripped of its context, it appeared almost pathetic, a hulking stone shell whose purpose had been to deceive. In its absence, the cavity beneath was no longer a secret but a focal point, a place where memory could no longer be denied. Plans were discussed to convert the area into a protected zone, a memorial that would speak honestly about what had occurred rather than cloaking it in vague symbolism. When he finally left the camp, his belongings reduced to what he could carry in a single duffel, he did so without regret. The company had offered no apology, only a curt termination notice citing violations of policy, but by then the loss of his job felt insignificant beside the magnitude of what had been set in motion. He paused at the edge of the forest, looking back at the clearing that had reshaped his life, and felt a quiet resolve settle in him. The names were no longer buried. They had been lifted into the light, carried on the voices of journalists, officials, and families who refused to let them fade again. He did not know what his own future held, whether he would find work or stability after the storm he had helped unleash, but he knew that he would carry those names with him wherever he went. In a world that had tried so hard to forget, Remembering had become an act of defiance, and it was one he intended to practice for the rest of his life. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe right now so you won't miss what comes next. Watch our other videos to uncover more hidden truths and unbelievable real-life stories. And share this video with someone who needs to see it today.